Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased today to rise on C-26 and to talk about this piece of legislation. But before I do that, I thought I'd just take this opportunity to say to my constituents to have a happy, Merry Christmas and a safe holiday season. I also want to relay those best wishes to my colleagues here in the House. You know, it's great to work with you, and it's been a privilege and an honor to be standing here this year and to discuss things like this bill and debating things. And I think Canadians are very happy. In fact, the latest polls are showing that they think this government's going in the right direction, and they'd applaud us for the work we're doing. So I trust we all have a good time back in our ridings, and we'll be able to talk to our constituents about pieces of legislation such as this one in C-26. You know, Madam Speaker, when you look at this piece of legislation, it's one of balance. I think balance has always been the key around this piece of legislation, is trying to get the balance right. And you know, if we got the balance right on this piece of legislation, I think there'd be a lot of radio talk show hosts who'd be out of work, or wouldn't have the old safety net of, what do I talk about today? Let's talk about victims of crime. Let's talk about people who make arrests or citizens' arrests, and then they become the person who's convicted. And that's what they're asking. And actually, if you go back to the riding of Prince Albert that I represent, and you talk to constituents, that's what they would instruct me when it comes to looking at victims of crime, or balancing in this case, or rebalancing the citizen's right to defend himself or their property. Madam Speaker, it's interesting when you talk about public security and you talk about the ability to defend yourself, depending where you are in the world, that has a different connotation. If you go down in the States, if you talk about the right to protect yourself and protect your property, you get the envisions of somebody steps inside the door and they're going to meet a nasty ending. You know, that's not what we're doing here in Canada. That's not even close. If you go to some other parts of the world, into Central or South America, where public security is always an issue, they would like to see what we're doing here today. They would think this would be a reasonable and balanced approach, and they'd like to see their police forces up to the level that our forces here are in Canada. I also want to remind members here, we're not saying remove the police force. We understand the role of the police force. We would recommend that if you're in a situation, unfortunately, an unfortunate situation where you're going to be a potential victim of crime, or you see a crime taking place, your first response should be 911. I don't think anybody's debating that. I think everybody's saying that, you know what, we should be involving the police as quickly and as immediately as possible so that they can possibly react. But you know, there always is circumstances where that's just not possible. There's always situations, depending on where you live, where you just cannot get a speedy response. And I'm not blaming the police officers, I'm not blaming the police forces. It's just the reality of the country we live in and the vast geography that we're in. If you take my hometown of Canada, Saskatchewan, and let's say the police officer who's working that night is at the far end of his area, and something's going on in the farm, or you're seeing somebody stealing gas, we can call 911. But reality is, it's going to take him probably 15 or 20, 25 minutes to get to my farm, just because of geography, just because of the distance it takes. It doesn't matter how fast he drives. That's what it's going to take. Now, when you talk to farmers, when you talk to people in rural Canada, they're not talking about revenge. They're not talking about going out and forming a posse and going to track people down who commit crimes. You know, the John Wayne scenario of the westerns of the 1800s, that's not what we're talking about here either. Nobody would accept that. What we're talking about is just balance, just simple balance. When that farmer comes across a guy stealing a quad out of his shop and he's able to apprehend him and hold him, he shouldn't be charged with kidnapping. He shouldn't be charged with assault. He shouldn't be charged at all, especially when you look at the situation and the facts around the situation. And that's all we're doing, is we're trying to make clarification for the courts and the police on when they should lay a charge and when they shouldn't. We're actually trying to balance that out. Now, I know the opposition members talk about amendments, and they have amendments they want to bring forward. I'd encourage them to bring them forward in committee. That's how you end up with good pieces of legislation. I trust these amendments are amendments that their constituents would want to see happen in this bill. And when those amendments come forward in committee, the committee will look at them, and I trust the committee will study all those amendments and make the suggestions back to this House, and then we will stand and vote based on what our constituents want. That's how our government works. So when it comes to amendments, I'd encourage you to take your amendments forward at committee. I would encourage you to bring them forward, make your passionate arguments, state your case, and then let the committee members and then let the members of Parliament decide the fate at that point in time. You know, Madam Speaker, when we start talking about the different things that go in the riding and the different types of crime that are possibly there, it's actually a very sad state, because nobody ever wants to be a victim of crime. Nobody ever asks for that. You know, when you're sitting out in the farm in rural Saskatchewan and somebody drives in your yard at 2 in the morning and you know, goes up to your gas tank and proceeds to break the valve off and steal gas from you, that farmer didn't ask for that. So that farmer should not be penalized when he goes out and apprehends that person. Or that farmer should not be penalized when he confines that person. You know, and that's what's happened in the courts today, is we've taken people that go about their day-to-day lives and are put in a situation that they did not create, and all of a sudden, like Mr. Martin had said earlier, or the member from Winnipeg had said earlier, I apologize, they're in a situation where now they're in the courts. They're defending themselves in the courts. Well, they didn't bring this on themselves. They didn't ask for that person to come steal gas off their farm. Why should they have to go through a 6-month legal battle? You know, that's all we were looking for in this piece of legislation, and that's what this piece of legislation is doing. Again, the word is balance. You know, when you look at the legislation, it proposes simplification and clarifications of the law. So what we're doing is we're basically allowing the police to have some clarification on when they should or shouldn't lay a charge. We're basically clarifying for the courts when it's appropriate to pursue a charge or not. You know, if we see a situation where somebody's doing, the proper word would probably be excessive force to restrain somebody or is being vindictive or planning, well then we expect them to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. This is not a license to go out and blow somebody away because they showed up on your piece of property. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here, again, is balance. So if somebody thinks that they've got a license or a blank check to now do whatever they want when somebody enters their land, no, they don't have that. And it's very clear in the legislation on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Again, balance is the word. And that's the theme of when you look at this piece of legislation, I'd say the word balance should be repeated over and over and over again. And if we get the balance right on this piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, I think you'll see Canadians being very happy with this government and very happy with this Parliament, because we've tackled an issue that has annoyed them for years and years and years. You know, that's one thing that my constituents will say when I go back to the riding here during the break, is they'll say, you know what, this Conservative government, at least you did stuff. You got into Ottawa, you made promises, you kept your promises, you did what you wanted. The Conservative government presented and delivered what the constituents of Canadians wanted. And they will respect us for us, and they thank us for that. So as we go back in the break week, and as this piece of legislation moves forward, I'd encourage all members to go back and talk to this piece of legislation with their constituents, but properly explain it. Explain what we're trying to do. You can distort it if you want. You can rile people up if you want. Anybody can do that. But if you sit down and say, you know what, we don't want a situation like we've seen with Mr. Chan to happen again. So how do we properly balance that so it doesn't happen again? How do we make sure that that farmer who's woken up in the middle of the night because somebody's stealing gas is not put in the situation where he's in front of the courts for the next 8 months just because he stopped somebody from stealing his gas? That's the balance that constituents want. That's the balance that Canadians need. And that's what we're doing in this piece of legislation. And if you're talking to your constituents and they say, you know, this is one thing you can make this piece of legislation better, then I'd suggest to the opposition members, bring that amendment to committee. Trust the committee to come forward with what they think is the best movement and the best work to develop this piece of legislation. But I do know one thing, Madam Speaker, what we have today is not working. When you have people that are being convicted or actually being pursued harder, and they're the victim of the crime versus the guy who actually commits the crime, you know something's out of balance. You know that this isn't correct. So, Madam Speaker, I guess I'll close with that comment and just remind the colleagues as we move forward with this piece of legislation and as they go back in their ridings, talk to your constituents about balance. Talk to them about what's appropriate level of security for public security, for their own public safety, and be interesting to see what you get for response. Because I know if we get this right, like I said when I started, there's a lot of talk show radio hosts that all of a sudden will lose a topic they won't have to talk about over the next 2 or 3 years. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, l'honorable député Louis Hébert.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son discours. Dans son discours, évidemment, il se veut rassembleur, il nous invite comme tel à apporter des amendements. J'aimerais lui rappeler que c'est son gouvernement qui a introduit 9 bâillons, n'a accepté aucun amendement jusqu'à maintenant dans aucun projet de loi adopté ici. Alors, j'aimerais comprendre, est-ce que le député d'en face s'engage ou non, au nom du gouvernement, à accepter des amendements raisonnables qu'on pourrait apporter de ce côté-ci de la Chambre? J'aimerais savoir si, pour une fois, on pourrait bonifier un projet de loi tel que ça doit l'être tout le temps lorsqu'on est en Chambre et en comité. Parce que c'est ça l'objectif, Madame la Présidente, de débattre. C'est d'améliorer les choses. Est-ce qu'à ce moment-ci, de ce côté-ci de la Chambre, nous pourrions, pour une fois, améliorer un projet de loi?
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the colleague for his question. You know, committees work, and I've said that 4 or 5 times in my presentation, that if you have amendments, bring them forward to committee. There's a process to be involved in the development of the legislation, and that is through the committee. Now, if your amendments are based on politics and not the best interest of the Canadians, yeah, they're not going to go far. But if they're true, legitimate amendments that Canadians want, I think this House would consider them very close. Now, he talks about pieces of legislation that, for example, C-10. I know they complain about that. But my colleague who spoke before me was very clear. That piece of legislation was made up of 5 pieces of legislation that was debated for, what, 4 years in the House? It had so much debate over and over and over again. There is no reason to delay. Canadians are saying, pass it, get it through, get it done with. You don't need to hack away at this thing again. We've heard all the debates. We've heard all the arguments. Can you not get in there and make up a decision? And that's what we did. We made a decision. We moved forward. So, again, I would encourage my colleague, when he goes back to his writing, if he's got some thoughtful amendments that are based on what's the best interest of Canadians, please bring those forward, and we'll consider them seriously.
Some comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Il me semble qu'aujourd'hui, le mot du jour du Parti conservateur, c'est balance. The word of the day is balance. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot of that from the other side of the floor. But I want to talk about democratic balance. So I'd like to ask the member, first of all, thank him for his remarks, but I'd like to ask the member, when the committee considers this bill, can he guarantee that the traditions of committee work will be followed, and the things that are discussed in the open and not in secret will be discussed in the open? Will committee work related to this bill be done in public, or will it be done in secret, as this Parliament seems to be doing a lot?
Honourable member for Prince Albert.
Well, Madam Speaker, I kind of take exception to that question, because committees have a process that they follow that is perceived to be balanced and fair. I don't see that process changing in this piece of legislation. You'll see it come through the House. It'll go to committee. In committee, there will be a chance to do a report or a study on it. They'll do basically recommendations, and based off those recommendations, they'll come back to the House, and then we'll vote on it again. So I guess I don't understand why he's so concerned. This is a very easy or simple piece of legislation. If he's got amendments, bring them through to committee, and they'll be heard, and then they can move forward. Thank you, Madam.
Order, please. I ask for people to make their comments after they've been recognized, rather than to shout from one part of the room. The honourable, there's less than a minute, so a 30-second question for the member from Wetaskiwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I listened intently to my colleague. Madam Chair, I'm going to ask my colleague, given the fact that we both represent rural ridings and some of the issues that, and he brought up farmers. There's a young farmer in my constituency that had perpetrators come into his yard, conspired to steal his property, and he got some neighbors and friends together. They tracked these guys down, got their property back, but in the process, the police had laid more charges against the person defending their property. I'm wondering if my colleague can add anything to this debate that would clarify.
I'll have to give the honourable member for Prince Albert 30 seconds to respond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the colleague for the question, and I appreciate the intelligent question, because it's actually one of substance. You know, you have to look at the situation. I'm not familiar with the entire situations, but it's very clear. We're not going to allow a group of farmers to get together the next day and form a posse and go after somebody. That's not allowed. That's very clear in this piece of legislation. But if they're in the process of committing the act and they're reacting to the commitment of the act, again, it's laid out pretty clear in the legislation on what should happen.